أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن في خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف الليل والنهار لآيات لأولي الألباب. الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض ربنا ما خلقت هذا باطلا سبحانك فقنا عذاب النار.
Good afternoon. I'm Leslie London. I'm the chairperson of the Observatory Civic, and I'd like to thank Imam Rashid Omar for giving us this opportunity to speak to you about the campaign against the River Club development. I'm speaking on behalf of the Civic, but we are supported by a wide range of other civic organizations, COI groups, environmental NGOs who are opposing this development because we believe it's an example of the environment being for sale and that the River Club approvals make no sense from the point of view of sustainable development. So this is a piece of land at the confluence of the Black and the Lisbech rivers shown here. To orient you, on the left-hand side, you'll see the Lisbech Parkway with a blue down arrow, and next to it the thread of the Lisbech River. On the right-hand side, you'll see the Black River. In the distance, you'll see the Table Bay into which the river is empty. Closer to you, you'll see the copse of wood where the South African Astronomical Observatory is located, and then closest to you is the Valkenburg Hospital campus. And the River Club land is the land with the red highlights. So it's a small piece of 14.7 hectare land at the apex of the confluence of the Lisbech and Black rivers. But this is not any ordinary piece of land. It's land that carries huge historical significance for all of us, and particular significance for the Khoi, because it's the site of the first resistance against colonial intrusion, where the Khoi successfully defended their settlements against the predations of the Portuguese Admiral de Almeida in 1510, but were later dispossessed by the Dutch settlers who displaced the Khoi from their lands by giving the land to farmers, the land that the Khoi had previously used for their herds. The piece of land on which the River Club stands was originally owned by the South African Railways. It was public land, and after a period of neglect was developed as a leisure resort for white railway workers as part of the Smuts government and other governments' upliftment programs for poor whites who had emigrated to the cities. This kind of social support for white workers was elevated to state policy under apartheid. There was no question at the time of any Khoi claims to land, given that white supremacy was the norm. The River Club building that you see here was constructed in 1939 to house the leisure activities. More or less a decade later, the existing Lisbech River was redirected east of the property through the construction of an artificial canal, which you can see under the bridge here on the Observatory Road, and that canal now carries the bulk of the Lisbech's water to meet the Black River at the Rapenburg wetlands. That has left the original course of the river intact, but requiring maintenance to ensure that the hydrological connection between the main river and its somewhat denuded continuation west of the River Club land is maintained. But the point is that the hydrological connection needs human action to keep it going, and it's been neglected by both the authorities and in fact by the River Club itself. Here's a newspaper cutting from 2013 where illegal works by the River Club on the riverbank led to a situation where the original river course is really mistreated, and that has enabled the chief planner for the River Club to claim in a municipal planning tribunal in September 2020 that the original river was nothing more than a neglected stormwater gutter. That the river is spiritually important to all Khoi groups has been reduced in the eye of the developer to a neglected stormwater gutter. In 2015, when the land was sold by PRASA, the Lisbech Leisure Property Pty Limited held a long-term lease to run a recreational centre on the land, on what was land zoned as open space. PRASA then sold the bare dominium to LLP for 12 million rand plus VAT, which is a price far below the market value for the land. Within a few months, LLP then sold the property on to a new but linked entity, the LLPT, Lisbech Leisure Property Trust, which raised a bond for 100 million, 8 times the buying price. Remember, 2015 was the pinnacle point for looting at PRASA, as we have seen in the Sonderkommissie hearings over the past months. It is this speculative deal based on land in a floodplain, which has been zoned as open space, that started the process of developing this massive mixed-use, high-density commercial development of 150,000 square meters of concrete and buildings of between 20 and 44 meters high, more dense in fact than Century City, as you can see from this vertical view, shown in contrast with the wooded South African Astronomical Observatory area on the other side of the canal. There were 2 steps to the approval needed by the developers, and one was to obtain a rezoning of the land from open space to permit this massive development, which is a function of the City of Cape Town, exercised by a body created under the Municipal Planning Bylaw called the Municipal Planning Tribunal, the MPT. The second was an environmental authorization under the National Environmental Management Act, which is administered by the Provincial Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning. And you can see how the decisions really speeded up over the last few years. From 2000 right through to 2021, it's been really one decision after the other in the last few years as it's been rushed through. The first draft scoping report under NEMA was released for comment in 2016. Amongst numerous concerns, the interested and affected parties, including the OCA, raised many environmental concerns, but also pointed out the land as being an important heritage resource rich in Khoi history. We've seen successive iterations of the report seeking environmental authorizations, but none of these dealt with environmental and heritage concerns. And in August 2020, the DEDP granted an environmental authorization to the developer. Despite multiple appeals, including an appeal from Heritage Western Cape, which is the competent heritage authority for the province, which stated straight out that the approval decision was unlawful because the proposal failed to meet the heritage criteria of the National Heritage Resources Act, and an appeal from the city's own Environmental Management Division, which expressed multiple concerns over violations of city environmental policies. The minister rode roughshod over all these appeals and rejected them. The images on the right show the scale of the buildings that would be placed on the land. The rezoning application to the city was first submitted in August 2018 and was advertised for comment by interested and affected parties at that time. There were hundreds of comments received by October 2018. The developers pended their application for rezoning whilst the other EA was going on, but as soon as they had secured the environmental authorization in August 2020, the city convened a hasty special meeting of the Municipal Planning Tribunal to consider the rezoning. This is despite the fact that the planning bylaw permits the city to re-advertise an application if 2 years have elapsed and if new information is available relevant to the application. And both conditions applied here. The MPT did not consider new information about flooding to be relevant, nor the final comments of Heritage Western Cape declaring the heritage impacts incompatible with law. And after a token appeal process, the Mayor rubber-stamped the rezoning in February this year. But behind all the smoke and mirrors is the behemoth Amazon, whose new Africa headquarters will occupy 60,000 square meters of the development, looming over a Khoi amphitheatre, indigenous herb garden and cultural centre, which some Khoi groups have accepted as adequate recognition of Khoi history. But this is in exchange for irrevocably destroying the intangible history of the sense of place of this open space. Mysteriously, Amazon's presence as anchor tenant was not made clear until the MPT meeting in September 2020. In fact, the developer's consultants attempted to remove documents in the EA process which demonstrated Amazon's intended tenure early in 2020. So what are the environmental issues at stake here? Firstly, the site is a floodplain. It floods regularly. The picture you see on the right is not uncommon. If you build in a floodplain, you're going to require massive earthworks to lift the land, probably by 3 meters or more. The very tall buildings will also require very deep foundations, not to mention the underground parking lots for which Amazon has laid claim to 2,000 bays. This will have an aggravating effect on flooding that cannot be disputed. However, the developers' hydrologists claim that the increased flooding will be negligible. But the hydrologist modelling was based on sea level data rise that is outdated, 10 years old or more than 10 years old. With climate change science evolving rapidly, it's absurd to use data for anticipated sea level rise that is so old. And incredibly, the hydrology report makes the assertion, and I quote, that an investigation of the impacts of sea level rise is beyond the scope of this study. However, it would be in the city's best interests to undertake further modelling to assess how climate change and sea level rise impacts could be mitigated. So they admit that they are using data that's actually not accurate. Hydrologists make the claim that it was agreed with the city that data from that 2010 study should be used for the current investigation. But that's odd, because the appeal that's lodged by the city's own environmental management department against the EA argues that the use of outdated data led to a significant underestimate. They also point out that the statement by the developers, and I quote, that portions of this proposed site fall below the 1 in 100 year flood line is simply misleading, because 90% of the River Club site is below the 1 in 100 year flood line, and not only a portion. In fact, more accurately, most of the River Club is below the 1 in 10 year flood line, and they call it simply a misrepresentation of fact. So, because of the increased flood risks, the city's stormwater department advised the developers to get the approval of the affected property owners nearby and to indemnify the city against claims in this regard. The developers did approach local property owners, but the property owners told the hydrologists to speak to the OCA, which they did not do. When the property owner asked them why they did not speak to the OCA, the hydrologist said that their client did not want them to engage with the OCA. So on the one hand, the developers' consultants dismiss any risk of flooding as significant, but they offer to flood-proof the nearest private houses. So it's not surprising the city's environmental management department say, and I quote, the decision maker failed to sufficiently consider the impact of infilling the natural Liesbeek River and the floodplain on adjacent property owners. Secondly, the land is a green space. The city's CSRM branch noted in their comments that the river corridor represents an integrated complex of open space with high green infrastructure value. There are many green spaces across Cape Town that have been lost because of this, and that's why these last open space remnants therefore have an even greater value. The fact that the River Club development will irrevocably change and reduce the green infrastructure and open space value as a whole is in contradiction to the city's own environmental management framework for the area, which lists the site as a structuring open space which forms part of the coast-to-coast greenway. Thirdly, the development will require infill of the existing Liesbeek River. This is not only offensive in terms of Khoi heritage, but it runs contrary to key city policies. The city's environmental management department pointed out that the Liesbeek River and floodplains are part of a metropolitan-scaled ecological corridor and open space system, linking Table Bay to the north and False Bay to the south, termed the Coast to Coast Greenway. It has been reflected in spatial plans for the area for some 30 years. The EM branch also pointed out how infilling a river is contrary to climate change mitigation policies. Fourthly, the biodiversity impacts in the proposal were underestimated. The city's environmental management experts point to what they call ill-conceived or flawed information, such as reliance on a desktop study to generate a faunal importance assessment score for mammals, reptiles and amphibians, rather than doing direct estimation, first-hand empirical research. Secondly, focusing only on the endangered western leopard toad and ignoring other important species on the site, such as the Cape dwarf chameleon and the clawless otter, also amongst the list of endangered or threatened species. Thirdly, failing to disclose the River Club land is actually a breeding site for the western leopard toad. Fourthly, ignoring their own evidence that if you infill the Lesbic River, it will adversely impact bird life and result in loss of habitat for indigenous fish. Also, they noted that the report asserted incorrectly that the Lesbic River no longer receives flow from the main Lesbic. They also pointed out that once the development happens, there will be no movement of animals. The paths across the Lesbic River site that used to traverse will be empty and unused. The EM department simply conclude the infilling of a natural river channel cannot be considered positive from an environmental perspective. Fifthly, the developer made the extraordinary claim that the Municipal Spatial Development Framework, which designates urban inner core areas as being appropriate to attract additional investment, would somehow mean that one conceptual element of the MSDF would override other city planning policies. In other words, because the River Club lay in the urban inner core, approval of the rezoning is somehow consistent with some policy. Cities EM point out that the urban inner core notion does not override the MSDF's biodiversity network, as if development were more important than conserving biodiversity. They go on to illustrate how the MSDF comprises a series of maps that collectively indicate a metropolitan-scale interpretation of the city's spatial vision, development directives, land use informants, and investment priority areas. In other words, these should all be read as a collection of maps of equal standing rather than a consolidated spatial plan concept overriding all other layers of spatial informants. Sixthly, climate change resilience was not specifically addressed in this process, and this is surprising given the recent court judgments, for instance involving the Philippi horticultural area, which said that a climate change assessment was absolutely essential in such matters. The only reference to climate change is the hydrological report, and as we have seen, that reference is rather perfunctory and dismissive of any need to updated modelling data. The city's EM appeal argued that substantial comments were provided by the city on a range of issues relating to climate change. The responses to these comments were not provided by either the environmental assessment practitioner or the decision maker in the EA. For example, they point out that the design concept shows disregard for addressing climate change impacts such as retaining waterways and wetlands as green lungs, which reduce the heat island effect. They note that infilling a river course and developing within a floodplain are not consistent with the stated objectives of the city's climate change policy. There would be loss of climate resilience by infilling the floodplain. In total, the EM branch cited climate change as a concern in 26 places in their appeal. Lastly, the development does not consider alternatives in any meaningful way, other than to tick a box as required of it under NEMA. The less dense development options are dismissed on the basis of a property valuator's report, which concludes that only 9% return on investment is feasible, and therefore only 150,000 square meters of development footprint was on the table. And this is because it's really expensive to build in a floodplain. You have to truck in those 3 meters of infill. So of course, the only way to get 9% is to build very high and very dense. The fact that the property valuator who authored that report is known to work for Investec, which is one of the partners invested in the development, is a conflict of interest that is not named in the project. So the report pointing to the 9% means that the only development on the table was this mega development versus nothing. Yet the city's own environmental management branch point out that the site could be developed as a park with some buildings in it, with a hotel, with a conference centre, perhaps, and be far more compliant with environmental management policies. But as is the case with many developments in South Africa today, the way the application was set up, it was structured to ensure only one outcome, the one favoured by the developers. Notably, there was a study by researchers from Delft University who presented a cogent alternative to infilling the Liesbeek River that would rehabilitate the existing river course without turning a canal into an artificial river as the proposal does. It would also at the same time improve water quality and quantity, enhance the city's climate resilience, reduce heat flux, stimulate the ecological services, ecology, and add amenity to the area. But consistent with how any other evidence contradicting the developers has been handled, this input was studiously ignored both by the developer and the decision maker. So, the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning is meant to be an impartial arbiter of development decisions, but it failed abysmally to do so in this case. Firstly, it joined the developers in opposing an effort by Heritage Western Cape to grade the River Club for heritage status prior to considering the development application. Heritage Western Cape issued a provisional protection order over the area. Moreover, after Heritage Western Cape turned down the HIA for the River Club as failing to meet the requirements of the National Heritage Resources Act, the decision maker simply bypassed Heritage Western Cape and approved the development, and extraordinarily allowed the developer to submit a rebuttal to the Heritage Western Cape final comment without meeting Heritage Western Cape, completely in violation of their own standard operating procedures for joint decision making on heritage matters. The city's equally flawed approval process allowed the developer to submit new documents that were not part of a public participation process, and also kept out of the process new documents that were germane to any decision. For example, Heritage Western Cape's rejection of the Heritage Impact Assessment. In our view, both processes were hugely biased and reflect the authorities' predetermined intention that the development should go ahead. The glee with which Amazon is being flaunted as the anchor tenant should alert us to ask questions of the city and the province as to what promises have been made to Amazon, a corporate behemoth that is well known for bullying governments to give them special deals. So, sustainable development is what is commonly known as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Typically, it includes a balancing of economic development, the environment, and the social needs of people. The environmental authorization, which approved the development, claimed that in line with provisions of NEMA, and I quote, "It is imperative that the triple bottom line argument is considered in a balanced manner and within its regional context, and that if this is not considered in a balanced manner, and if not evaluated within its regional or strategic context, it will result in significant cumulative negative environmental impacts and unsustainable development." Well, this is puzzling because the city's environmental management department used the same arguments but arrived at the opposite conclusion. They expressed their concerns that the regional and strategic context had not been adequately considered by the decision maker, and that there will be significant cumulative negative environmental impacts and risks. Moreover, needs are not just for commercial centres, hotels, gyms, or cheaper web services or ease of remote shopping, but also for retention of our heritage and recognition of our mutual history, our collective memory, essential for our humanity. Irrevocably destroying that history is a death knell to sustainable development. So now that we have exhausted all the administrative remedies, the OCA, supported by a coalition of more than 60 First Nations, civic and NGO groups, will take the rezoning and the environmental authorization on review to the High Court. We believe we have a strong case and will demonstrate why both decisions were flawed and why this development is hugely inappropriate and damaging to the environment, for heritage, and for our democracy. I thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the dispenser of grace, we thank you, God, for the gift of life and of friendship. We implore you to bless our proceedings here today and to bless this plant that we are reinstalling We ask you to guide us, to realize our struggles, to reclaim our heritage and our dignity. Ya Rabb al-Shifa, O Lord of healing, heal us from our apartheid socialization and our identity crisis, and inspire us to recognize our African ancestors. Ya Rabb al-Qist, O Lord of compassion and justice, grant us the courage and the fortitude to liberate ourselves from the ruling class of the city who are marginalizing the Kabisa people of the Cape Flats. Bless us with selfless leaders who will mobilize and empower us to restore our ancestral rights and human dignity. Nas'aluka bi asma'ika al-husna, and we ask this in all of your holy and beautiful names. Ya Rabb al-Nas wa Rabb al-Alameen, O Lord of all humankind and of all cultures. Bi barakati Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
This is part of our heritage. We must be united for our heritage. On the coat of arms of South Africa, it says, Hey, Ehe, Harakhe, Hey, Ehe, Harakhe.
We'd like to invite you and welcome you to our inaugural Freedom Walk. This is a very historic occasion for us. It is the first time that we celebrate our shared history in this significant manner.
It is the shared narrative that we will be talking about today. On the banks of the Liesbeek River, when those farms were established, the Khoikhoi did not surrender. And because the Dutch East India Company, which was the first company that had a large standing army and was a capricious master, had very high demands from their freeburgers. And in the absence of free, cheap labor, because they were battling with the resisting Khoikhoi. And just to mention the peninsular groups that are of akin here, would include groups like the Chorokhokwa, the Gorenaikwa, the Gorenaikona, the Kaikorana. And through this emerged a diversity, the paradox of the Kuna people today, the beauty of that diversity, which includes every footprint of the globe, but is deeply founded and nourished on the earth of this terrain. And that is what we will commemorate today. It is a time where, as communities, we will determine for ourselves what we are going to preserve, what we are going to nourish, and what we are going to protect. We will move from this place and go down to the embankments of the Black River. There we will acknowledge the water. And then we will snake around, go over the Oudtshoorn Bridge that moves into Valkenburg, and around the perimeter wire, through the conservation area, through another bridge, in between the South African Observatory itself, and acknowledge the term Amirodi Ayes, which means the place where the stars gather, and say that this is the name of our place where the stars gather, and that as people, as residents, as those who are connected to this place, we have the ultimate inheritance of the stars and the ultimate inheritance of being the custodians of a ground zero precinct, a place of reckoning, and ultimately a place of our healing.
My name is Kuba Melvin Arendse. I'm the king of the Kaikurana Transfrontier. Today we are standing here in protest against what is supposed to protect us as the National Environmental Management Act, NEMA. We cannot have legislation that is supposed to protect our environment and then serves as decoration when it comes to corporate interest. We want to appeal to the Minister of Environmental Affairs and in particular to Minister Nathi Ntetwa, Minister of Arts and Culture, to intervene on the question of the Two Rivers Urban Park, since the Two Rivers Urban Park in Oudemolen has been nominated as heritage sites nationally. It has also been nominated as World Heritage Sites. So we want to understand, is the Western Cape an independent republic, or is it accountable to South African law and legislation? For now, for today, we are making it clear here, we're making it clear to Alan Winder, to Dan Plato, that the Western Cape is not an independent republic and that they are not above national laws. And we want to tell Amazon, our freedom was not brought about by Amazon. Our liberty was not brought about by Amazon. Our spaces of significance was brought upon by the blood of our ancestors and the sacrifices of Purana.
Unremembering is a deliberate process by those in power and by those with power. Unremembering, taking out of history, distorting history, reshaping history, remolding history, retelling history in order to fit the dominant narrative of those in power and those with power. We are here today to tell them that that process of unremembering has failed, because we are here to remember, to recall, and we shall honor, and we shall tell our children what happened here today. And as from today, the 27th of April, and the remembrance of our freedom, they will never be the same, because that element that has been excluded for 27 years, we have now brought back with our purpose and our willingness